achievements.
Thanks, Kayla. Alrighty, that works. Great. So as some of you might know, this talk is based on an article we wrote together last year, which feels like a lifetime ago. And I'm going to give you some context on that. So I was in a meeting last year with a bunch of product manager types discussing the experiences of one of our key client segments. So that was employers that are small to medium business owners. They advertise jobs on our website. I mentioned that this particular segment are known to use competitor websites when advertising jobs. This was a finding from a recent research study I conducted earlier that year, and this bunch of product manager types knew all about that research. However, one of the stakeholders in the room turned around and said, well, that's an assumption, isn't it? Later that day, I whinged to Kayla, so whinge is Australian for complain, and the Medium article was born. So in that article, we wanted to document the different kinds of assertions you might hear from your stakeholders that invalidate qualitative research and testing. And we then wanted to debunk those assertions, which is what this talk is based on. Alrighty. So I know we said questions at the end, but I do want to get a sense from the room, the virtual room. Who's had an experience like the one I just described before? Can I get a thumbs up on your Zoom control if you've heard something like that, or if someone's tried to tell you your research doesn't matter? Yep, Liz, yeah, thumbs up. Yep, Kayla, of course. Sandy. Yeah, okay, so a few people have heard this sort of stuff before. Liz, I'm curious, would you like to share, given this is a safe space, just what you've experienced?
Yeah, I've experienced everything from clients saying, you know, we're not paying for that. That's just it's a waste of time. That's just standing between us and actually getting anything meaningful done. And, you know, what are you going to find out anyway? You know, people don't know what they want. So yeah, I feel like I've heard it all in terms of trash talking usability research.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, yeah, I've definitely been in situations too where you get told, oh, what are you going to find out? We already know what people want, or people don't know what they want. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, these stories I think are pretty common across UX and UX researchers, and they're definitely common in Melbourne. Cool. So tonight we're going to talk you through the most common assertions that we've heard that kind of poo-poo or decry qualitative user research. As I read through these, there's 8 of them. I'd like to get, again, a Zoom thumbs up if you've heard it before, just so we can get a sense of what you've all experienced. So the first one is, oh, it's only 5 or 10 or 12 people. Who's heard that before? Yeah, I can see a few nods as well. Yep. Yep, Melanie and Sandy as well. What about the next one? Oh, that's just an assumption. That's just a generalisation. Or even, are you really sure? Who's heard that before? Yep, Liz again. Cool, so the third one is, oh, it's just people's opinions, isn't it? Yep, a few thumbs up again. And the fourth one, but what about the say-do gap? People say things they don't actually do. Who's heard that one before? Yep, a few more thumbs up again. And then, oh, well, it's all subjective anyway. It's all open to interpretation. We get that one a lot. Yeah, a few nods. And then this one's one of my personal favorites. Well, that's not my experience. Who's heard that before? Yeah, I've just seen Melanie do the clap. Yes. Yeah, another thumbs up from Sandy. And then, well, I can't make a decision based on this qualitative research. Anyone heard that one? You kind of wonder how much data these people need. And then the last one, which is, you know, the crux of this talk, it's not real research. Yeah, okay. So I think we're all pretty familiar with these assertions. Now, Kayla and I are going to arm you with some arguments to kind of clap back a little bit, so to speak. Kayla, over to you.
Thanks, Caylie. So the first one, it's only 5 people. I'm sure we've all heard some variation of this before, and we saw some thumbs up and nods when we asked. And many designers know the line, 5 users pick up most of the usability problems, but not everyone actually knows the background behind that. So I'm going to explain the logic behind this, which is good if you ever have a stakeholder who wants evidence. And there's a reference that will show you, which I've literally included in emails, sometimes getting aggressive. Per this academic study, this is valid. So first, in usability research, we recruit specific participants who are reflective of the intended audience. So it's not just 5 random people. And if we have 2 distinct audience groups or more, we do 2 studies. Caylie, next slide. Thank you. Secondly, yes, 5 targeted participants find about 85% of the usability problems that group experience. And after that, you're just spending money on diminishing returns. It takes 15 people to find all of the problems, yes, on average, but you're hearing a lot of the same things over and over again. So it's more bang for your buck to do 2 rounds of 5 participants. So speak with the 5, find out 85% of the problems, go and fix them, and then take it back to testing, and you'll find the last 15, hopefully. And we know this from a peer-reviewed academic study published in the most prestigious journal from human-computer interaction, Chi. So I like to pull this reference out and say, look, they used math to prove it and everything. But yes, once you throw usability metrics in there, you are going to need larger numbers. You can't state that 90% of users experience something when it's only 5 people. You can't do quant analysis at that level, so you're going to be looking at 20 to 30 or more users in that scenario. In research, saturation is reached when additional participants aren't providing any additional insights. So again, you start hearing the same thing over and over again. And there's some agreement in the literature that 12 to 15 participants suffice for understanding common views and experiences of a homogeneous group. And again, based on academic research. So of course, while your time, resources, and foci of the research will shape how many participants and groups you include, this gives you a ballpark of the number to aim for. So we'll give you an example from a piece of research that Caylie ran. The majority focus was small, medium business owners in cities. So that made up 10 of the 12 participants, and the other 2 were from regional locations. And that ratio also reflects the Australian metro regional divide. So it was a representative population to understand their views.
Cool, thanks, Kayla. And yes, Australia is heavily urbanised, so we typically reflect that ratio in the studies we do. Cool, so the next assertion that we're going to debunk for you is well, that's a generalisation. Are you really sure? We say no. It's something several people told us that they do. And if it's come up fairly frequently, that's probably worth exploring further. There's a couple of different ways to combat this one. The first is reminding stakeholders of the methodology you used. So you can talk about the methods you used in your research by first giving the correct name of the method. So for example, if it was a contextual inquiry, say it was a contextual inquiry, and then describe what it is. So you're going out to observe people doing stuff, and then you might do some interviewing. And also talk about what the method is intended to do, so people don't confuse, for example, surveys with co-design with something else, which happens a lot. This adds a layer of rigour. Be careful not to bamboozle your stakeholders with lots of scary terminology. Use the terminology, but always explain what it means. Secondly, remind your stakeholders of who was in the study. As Kayla said before, your research participants will hopefully be representative of whichever population you are studying, and that means you will have greater generalisability of the findings. So extrapolating in that case is pretty acceptable. This also ties into, I just said that, we know the number of users we need to recruit to ensure the sample is representative of a particular population. So yeah, we are generalising, but the user's representative, so we can. You must also use the right language to talk about your research. So ensure that you refer to your research participants as participants rather than business owners or chocolate chip cookie eaters, as an example. This avoids overgeneralising the population too much, And it reminds your stakeholders that much like a scientific study, quote unquote, we also have research participants in UX research studies. They come from the same area of academia after all. Another couple of things to watch. Make sure to call your research research and not customer conversations or talking to users or so on. This is really important to differentiate between UX research and more rapid approaches like continuous discovery or whatever else you might find out there. Cool. So I want to talk about stakeholder assumptions for a moment as well. If you do have some time on your hands, lean into the curve. Get all your stakeholders together and map out every single assumption they have, what they think is going on. And also map out the ones they think you have. Ask them to tell you what they think your assumptions are, what they think you're making up. And then go through those assumptions one by one and ask what evidence there is to support that assumption. If any of your research insights get posited as an assumption, that's actually a great opportunity for you to run through your methodology and insights again. You're showcasing your research again. So it's no longer an assumption, it's known because you did the research and you've just shown them you did the research. Back to you, Kayla.
Thanks, Caylie. It's just people's opinions. So there are two branches of research. One is positivism and one is interpretivism. In positivism, I've picked really hard words for myself to say. We believe that facts are facts and that research is uncovering the laws of the universe, which is great for determining the laws of physics. Gravity, after all, doesn't care if you believe in it or not. But that's not what UX and design research is about. We're exploring human behavior to inform design and uncover potential problems to be solved, not to emphatically state something to be true of every single person on the planet. We are just the Lorax, or the Lori, I'm not really sure what the plural is, speaking for the trees, or the UXer speaking for the users. All social research is based on understanding opinions. It's interpretivism, where what we know as knowledge is subjective and shaped by individual experiences. Whether I find something usable is based on the knowledge that I bring to the table. These opinions help us understand behaviors, motivation, needs, and problems of our target users, which helps us structurally explore a problem that we might not know a lot about. The results from such research help us identify gaps and opportunities for potential solutions.
Sorry, I forgot your animation there.
That's okay.
Cool. So the next one is around the say-do gap. So I work in quite a data-driven environment and I come across this one quite a lot. I often get stakeholders saying to me, well, the person may not actually do the things they say they do, so why would you believe them? So let's unpack this say-do gap business. The say-do gap refers to a behaviour shown by research participants. Sorry, there's a police car outside my window, where they'll say they do something, but they won't actually do it in practice. And to be honest, I think most of us do this. So some examples of this could be a research participant says to you, I pay off my credit card each month. This may not be true for the participant, but they might want you to think they're responsible and money savvy. That is the social desirability and conformity bias popping up here. A good how might we statement coming out of this finding might be, how might we enable users to pay off their credit card in a timely way? Even if that's not what they are doing, they want to be because they've told you they do, and maybe they're not telling the truth, but they want you to think they know what they're doing. Another example of this, well, I wouldn't use a resume builder because I know how to write a good resume. If a research participant says something like that, it could be that they're trying to show you they're capable, they know what they're doing. They want you to think they're good at stuff, put simply. So another form of this is where a participant might use a product differently in different contexts. This is where contextual research comes in handy. Do it post-COVID, or you can watch someone do it over Zoom. Seeing a participant use a product in their own environment means they're much more likely to be natural in using it. And having those participants interacting with the product in the moment and getting responses, as opposed to asking what they think in a survey or during a usability test, means we'll get a more natural response. So to summarise, the say-do gap does exist, However, we need to recognise that participants still think these things, or they want us to believe that they do. That's quite compelling in itself. If it's front enough of mind for them to bring up, it's likely important, or maybe it's aspirational. And if it is aspirational, maybe we can help it become a reality through problem solving. So as I said earlier, you can get around the say-do gap by coupling your interviews with in-context observation or tracking user behaviour on site. A good researcher is able to recognise social desirability bias and probe to counteract that through either repeating what the participant has just said or questioning when they appear to be contradicting themselves. You've got to watch for these things so you can unpack them. And sometimes that means you need to go off book a little bit in your interviews. Even if they were just opinions, right? That's 12 additional opinions from real users to help us make better decisions. We are never trying to tell people exactly how the world is. We're trying to de-risk and help people understand their users, what they're doing, and what that could mean. And I just want to read a funny quote from a friend of mine who also works in Melbourne. If you placed a chair in the middle of a hallway and you see 3 out of 5 people walk into that chair, swerve around it, or maybe feel a bit annoyed that the chair was in their way, would you move the chair? You probably would. It'd be a bit psychopathic if you didn't. And that's from a friend of mine called Chris Marmo, who runs a consultancy in Melbourne. And I think that really sums up this argument well. If you see or hear people doing something, doesn't quite work out, you'd probably change it. Back to you, Kayla.
Thanks. So it's all subjective anyway. This is again interpretivism. Yes, the research that we do is somewhat subjective. People are complex. We study what occurs in a particular context and how participants explain their statements and actions, and we try and make analytical sense of these. We research to qualify the subjectivity. Just because Sam does not like green eggs and ham does not mean that the users won't. Further, UX is all subjective. Every single user experience with your product is influenced by the previous knowledge, feelings, taste, opinions, and other interaction experiences they've had. This is why you, or the stakeholder who's arguing with you, also can't be the definitive test for if your product is good or bad. Your views are subjective too. UX is quantum. Your product is both good and bad, usable and unusable, alive and dead, until you observe your users interacting with it. It's Schrodinger's UX.
I love that analogy with the cat. Brilliant. Alrighty. Cool. So this next one, which is one of my personal favourites, is the old, well, that's not my experience, which I hear quite a lot. So recently I was giving a presentation that included, among other things, the fact that employers will still skim an applicant's resume for a job to find out key information. They do this even though they have access to summarised versions, for example, looking on someone's LinkedIn profile. They will always go through and skim someone's CV and application. I then had an audience member tell me, well, I recently hired for this role and that's not what I did. So this person was working in the technology part of our company and they told me, well, they didn't do that. Variants of this argument include, well, my mum / husband / neighbour's best friend uses this product and doesn't have the problems these users did, or doesn't do X, Y, Z. We also hear, oh, it's the user's fault they didn't understand that, which is a bit rude. Or even, these just aren't the right users. You didn't speak to the right people. Now, Kayla and I have never experienced prostate cancer, childbirth, or naturally straight hair. Contrary to what you see, Kayla is naturally curly haired. There's quite a few things that Kayla and I haven't experienced, but this doesn't mean that those things don't exist just because they don't occur for us. They do occur for other people. If you're feeling a bit cheeky, you can simply pose this question to your stakeholder if they use this argument against you. You can say, well, are you really discounting this person's experience? Would you discount this person's experience if it was childbirth or if they did tell you they have naturally curly hair? If they wouldn't discount other people's experiences, why would they be doing it here in a research study? In a similar vein, I've never been a 13-year-old boy, but I still managed to buy my 13-year-old male cousin a present. It's really not hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and that's another message you can send here. In this case, I figured that Australia has scary spiders, lots of them, and most 13-year-old boys seem to like scary things. So I bought my cousin a scary Australian spider book, and he's from England and he thought it was great. In the example I gave before with the audience member, I gently reminded him that, yes, not every single employer out there is going to read through an applicant resume. Some of them will just skim, some of them will go to LinkedIn or something else. But in this research study, in which I had recruited a number of seasoned employers across multiple industries, they did do this. Enough of them did this particular thing to make me draw a conclusion that this behaviour must be pretty common, enough for me to write about it. Another variant of this one is the good old, well, I didn't see it, so it didn't happen. Sometimes your stakeholders just refuse to believe what you've observed in user research to be true because they weren't there. And well, I meant for my design to be understood differently. No one understands this design and how brilliant I am. And yeah, we've come across that a few times before. You've probably heard this argument a lot, but they're not the user. People who work in UX typically are, and most of us on this call, we're probably more tech savvy than the person who will be using whatever product or service you're designing. Just because it makes sense to us doesn't mean it's going to make sense to someone else. And we also work in and are familiar with the company for which we are designing, usually. Again, if you're feeling cheeky, you can ask your stakeholder if they believe in gravity. We can't see gravity either, but we know it exists.
Thanks, Caylie. I can't make a decision based on this. Well, that does depend on what you're deciding. So if you're looking at opportunities to pursue or explore further, whether the design that you're testing is usable for the desired population, whether the design or idea has legs, that is, it has a value proposition, you're going to have a pretty good idea after 5 to 12 people which direction to go in. But yes, if you are deciding on whether this cool new thing you found out from a round of exploratory research is something worth pursuing investment-wise and how big that opportunity is, you are going to need some quant data to back that up. But qualitative research still will have helped identify that opportunity. So qualitative research is real research. UX researchers follow a scientific method, which we've either learned at uni or learned on the job, working with folks who have been doing UX research since before it was called UX. We follow a similar process to academic research. It's just been modified to work faster and leaner in agile and corporate contexts. UX research has roots in human factors, human-computer interaction, psychology, and ethnography. So let's get academic for a moment. While we may or may not have a hypothesis that we are trying to prove or disprove, we always have research questions stated about what we are trying to find out from this study. We evaluate and consider different methods that we could use to answer the posed research question. We design a specific instrument, so survey questions or interview questions, to answer that research question. So that's what we're actually asking the participants, ensuring that we're not biasing or priming them to help us explore and answer the research question. We recruit specific participants from a defined sampling case or population to take part in the research. We conduct the research, collecting data through observations, interactions, interviews, or surveys. We separate, sort, and synthesize the data through qualitative coding. Coding distills data to give it a frame through which we can make comparisons amongst the data, which to us as UX researchers and designers, it might look like Post-it notes on the wall as I have in frame behind me, and an affinity mapping them together in broader groups or themes. But in academic speak, this is qualitative coding. We compare, contrast, and analyze the data to make inferences and conclusions. And as Caylie mentioned before, when reporting on these findings, we refer to participants or respondents instead of user group name, cookie eaters, job seekers, patients, to avoid generalizing. The process that I've just summarized is literally paraphrasing the research methods chapter of my PhD dissertation, which I really hope is real research, which means UX research is real research.
Awesome. So I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts to ponder before we open for questions. So findings from qualitative UX research are more useful to help guide decisions rather than a stakeholder emphatically denying what the research is showing us. Ask your stakeholders what's more scientific, research or their opinion. And if they're still really stuck on their opinion, ask them what it's based on. If they're questioning you, you are more than welcome to question them, depending on how highly paid they are. If they still don't believe your research, they're now the one who doesn't think the research is valid. In any decision-making process in any organisation, we should be assessing all of the facts and evidence available to us. And good decision makers will do this. Qualitative research is one set of information that can be considered amongst other data points. All research, no matter where it comes from, works to reduce uncertainty. No matter the amount of information you or your team or your company has at its disposal, you're never going to be 100% certain about the decisions you make. If your stakeholders are still really unsure, if they're still questioning you, you can suggest 3 things. First is, well, research begets more research. If they're still not trusting you, they can fund another quant or qual study. They can pay for it. They can always do the research themselves, with your guidance, of course, and see what they find out. But we find that makes stakeholders run away from us in terror because research is hard. And the last thing to ask is, well, what other evidence do you have? Where are they getting their ideas, their opinions, their thoughts from? Does it conflict with what you found out? Or is it the same? Was it really just their opinion? Don't be afraid to ask questions. Another thing to do is to triangulate your qualitative data with other data in your organisation. Make friends with the people in your market research team, your digital analytics team if you have one, and even your strategy team. I annoy mine very frequently. You can use their work to help you back up any attitudes and opinions, what people do, and any trends or futures. And that makes your research look even more legitimate. There was some slang there. Another important point too, which I deal with a lot, is that more numbers doesn't necessarily mean the quality of the data is better. Lisa Reichert from Atlassian, that's a company based in Sydney, has written a great article on this, which I can share with you all afterwards. Essentially, it says that we have a tendency to more readily trust data from surveys or anything that seems bigger, simply because there are more numbers to it. This is, again, an opportunity for you to explain the difference between and the purpose behind qualitative research and quantitative research. And the last thing on our list, you need to be able to justify the why. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, how late you work, or how much you beg, you will just not get the right number of participants or the right type of participants or the right majority or minority focus. It's not ideal, but often we have to make do thanks to timeframes, budget constraints, or hard to find user groups, particularly if we're working in large corporates, which want everything done yesterday. The important thing is being able to justify why you've made the choices you've made in your recruit, what trade-offs you've made, and how that might impact the research findings. And now we're open for questions. I should mention too, you can find us both on LinkedIn if you want to connect. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only me in existence, I think. And so is Kayla. We both have unique names.
Folks, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask an out loud question, or there's always the chat bar too for questions.
I'm just looking at the chat now, hopefully. Winch. Yeah, people use Winch, I'm glad. Yeah.
I have a question. So how were you able to overcome the situation when the stakeholder was denying or minimizing the research? And that way, I know, and a strategy, me being a junior designer in the future.
Yeah.
Caylie, did you want to?
I was going to share with the example that led to this article and now this talk. The person in question was a head of product, so someone fairly senior. At that point in that meeting, I let the comment go because it wasn't the right environment for me to say, hey, no, that's not right. What I did do instead was just gently remind him every time I spoke to him that, remember this research I did? And over time, it slowly started to sink in. And recently he actually asked me where it was kept so he could use one of the outputs I created from it. That was a win. It took a while, and these things do take time, particularly if you're new to an organization. It will take you a good, at least in my experience, 6 months to a year to change the way people perceive UX research. So be persistent, keep reminding people it's there, keep referring back to it and what you found out and what you did, and you will get traction. Kayla, did you have anything to add there?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it. There's another question in the chat. What research methods would you recommend in an organization that doesn't allow us to directly contact end users? Yeah, that is very hard, and I experienced that in my last role. I guess without knowing more context, I tried to find a way around it, and I tried to go to representative users. So the last place I worked did epilepsy diagnostics. So it was both people with epilepsy, people suspected of having epilepsy, and neurologists. So I would go down to the hospital and recruit from waiting rooms of representative patients. I sat in with patients' permission, of course, on days worth of neurologist appointments. So even though I couldn't contact our users, I went and contacted people with the same characteristics.
So another question from Liz. What do you do when the stakeholders want to pick their users for you? Yeah, this is a good one. Yeah, okay. So my immediate thought is you've got to find a balance between making friends with the people who maybe control access to those users and they're the ones picking your users, and also not ending up with a skewed recruit. So I've actually got a good example for this one. I conducted some research last year with our corporate clients at Seek. They're our big customers, like, what's an example you would all know? Well, the bank I mentioned before that I used to work at is one. So Australia's largest banks, a large telecommunications company, those sorts of people. And in order to get to these people, I had to go through the sales account managers. And they would sort of say, oh, you know, this person's great, talk to this person. And I'd sort of be like, no. So what I did, I created an ideal recruit. And that had a number of different variables in terms of where they were located, the business size, industry, and so on. And then I contacted the sales managers directly and said, look, I want to speak to these users for these reasons. Can you at least ask them? And if you can't get me that, who would you recommend instead? So that way I'm giving them a little bit of leeway to sort of suggest their favourite people, but I'm also sort of saying, look, this is who I need to speak to for these reasons. The recruit ended up being kind of a blend of what I had originally wanted that was ideal and just who I could get based on who was willing to talk to me. And I actually made that explicit when I presented the research, and I said, look, in an ideal universe, I would have spoken to these people. It didn't turn out like that. This is what I got instead. So this is some of the things we need to be aware of in terms of the insights and how accurate they are. Kayla, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the sales team especially can be an interesting one. So at the company where I was having difficulty getting access to users, I was told, well, the salespeople go and talk to them. Can't they give you feedback? And I was like, well, a sales pitch and wanting to ask about our problems are probably not appropriate in the same meeting. But what I did, similar to Caylie, was to say, you know, got them to ask questions that weren't around our problems. So, you know, what patient record management system are you using? So I could start to gather that intel over time, but also to kind of prime them and see if they'd be open to research in the future and make those introductions, but not do it themselves. I can see another question around assuming that I meant not doing 2 rounds of testing with the same 5 people. Yeah, probably. It does depend on the study though. So I have had studies where I've got the same participants to see things multiple times as it evolved, but usually I would use different participants. And then another related question. Oh, sorry, did you want to add more?
I'm just rereading what Marcella has said. Hopefully I'm saying that right. On how to deal with that situation. So I'm assuming, Marcella, that you cannot access these users through a recruitment agency or what have you, so you need to do it through your organisation. Is there anyone in your organisation that also has access to these users, but not the same ones that you were talking to. I wonder if you can circumvent these stakeholders and sort of, what's the phrase? Do first, apologize later. Sometimes you need to get a little bit.
Ask for forgiveness, not permission.
That's the one. Yes. Question from Anise. What do you do when stakeholders make assumptions of what their users want?
You know, the infamous, but he probably never said it, quote of, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. I usually pull that out. So when people say, I know what the users want, I don't need to ask. You know, Steve Jobs never asked, Henry Ford never asked. I will explain that any good researcher would not have come away with that saying they want a faster horse. They would have come away from it saying they need a faster way to get from point A to point B. That is the underlying need, and that is what we solve. We don't just do what the participants asked for. So when the stakeholder assumes that they know what they want, I kind of question, do you really, and how do you know what they want? And, you know, have you dug that that extra layer, because you're really good at your job, but it's not research. And, you know, there's some things that, this is why you hired me, basically.
Yeah, really good point there around just asking questions. I always ask heaps of questions of my stakeholders, and they probably hate me for it. But it also means that I can understand the problem space better and understand where their head's at. I would add too, there's nothing stopping you, depending on how much time you have, from just including their assumptions in your research and going, oh, okay, you know, that's a great idea, XYZ person, I'll include it in the research and just double check that for you. And you can sort of sneakily try and disprove it in your research if you like, but you can tell them that you're just going to double check it for you, which I've done a few times.
So I have a kind of controversial question, and I'm curious because I was asked this and I really didn't have a good answer for it recently. What is the difference between somebody who's coming from a master's or a PhD user research background versus somebody who's kind of worked through the technical end and has maybe had 10 years of user research experience? What are the different kinds of things you're getting from somebody who's coming from a user research educational background versus somebody who's kind of coming through the ranks of user UX design, we'll say, and having to use user research over time? Like, kind of what is that cost benefit analysis and what is the difference you're going to get from an educational background, with the caveat that I have no idea what goes into a master's or a PhD in user research?
Yeah, well, yeah. It depends. So Caylie comes from a more on-the-job learning UX research methods, and I come from a more formal academic background. I think Caylie is a great researcher. I hired Caylie actually originally. So I think it does depend on the person. I wouldn't discount someone just because they don't have a formal degree. I know lots of excellent UX researchers who don't have formal backgrounds in UX. I guess the difference is, and again, it's something you can all learn on the job, but is around that framing and the understanding and being like, this is qualitative coding, this is interpretivism, like pulling out those big gun terms for when your stakeholder doesn't believe you. But again, it's something that can be learned and is kind of where this article came from. And there's also probably a second article that I want to write around, you know, academic terms you need to know for your UX role.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Kayla. So yeah, Kayla has quite an academic formal background in UX. My academic background is in languages, linguistics, and finance. So a bit different to UX, but that's okay. I think, yeah, it does depend on the person a lot. So you can tell when a UX or a UX researcher has not got a formal background, but they're keen to learn, they will be out there reading all the books, learning all the terms, soaking up as much knowledge as they can. And they generally accept that they don't know everything and you will never know everything. That is the person to look for in terms of who to hire necessarily. And I think the flip side too is that folks coming from an academic background into UX are just often like, oh my God, how do I do this research in such a short amount of time? In that scenario, people like me will say, look, you're going to have to let some of your perfectionism go. we don't have time for that stuff in corporate, it's not going to be perfect. So yeah, finding a balance between the academic rigor and speed is really important for UX researchers. And I think Kayla and I, coming from different backgrounds, have both managed to do that and sort of meet in the middle, if that makes sense. The UX research program. I'll talk to you about that later, Liz, too, because I've got stuff on that. So Liz has got a question. As qualitative researchers, how do you deliver effective presentations to stakeholders who seem to only understand graphs? Oh, yeah, I can talk to that one, Kayla, if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Cool. So as I said in the presentation, I come from a very data-driven organisation where graphs are really popular. I like to, so I started off doing the typical PowerPoint, which was quite wordy. As a researcher, you do love words. I've learned, though, that it's always helpful to try and be as visual as possible. So even little things like bolding your text, putting in really clear headings, having your slide transitions not have too much text on one page really helps with the readability. Also scattering in little clips of your participants, so videos, audio if you have it. If they've done any drawings for you as part of their activities, put those in as well, because it just adds a human layer to what you're talking about. What else have I done? Oh, this is probably one for pre-COVID. I'm not sure how you do it. Sorry, pre or post-COVID. I'm not sure how you do it virtually, but I ran an expo once. So I ran a study, and instead of presenting it, I stuck up all the insights in lovely colourful paper around the room, and I played videos of the participants throughout the day, and I had people just come in and walk through like it was a museum exhibit. And that worked really well because it was like the researchers everywhere around you. It was quite engaging. Do you have anything to add there, Kayla?
Yeah, just to reiterate some of your points, I really like to do a one-pager, and that is quite visual. I like to have the participants as little icons, if they consent to that, of course, to be like, hey, look, I spoke to these 5 people, I didn't make it up. I do use graphs where I can. Obviously, you don't want to stretch the truth, especially when there's such small numbers. But if I've done one round and I'm doing a second round, I might have a graph that shows here was the ease of use with version 1 and here's the ease of use of version 2. So they can see there is an upward trend, hopefully. And again, highlight reels, like Caylie said, I find those really powerful. So there was a comment earlier when we were talking about people love anecdotes, and they absolutely do. So when they can see the user struggling to click a button and you show that to a developer, in my experience, they go back to their desk and they fix that button really quickly, as opposed to me just saying, oh, they can't find it. And they go, yes, they can. I don't have any trouble. It's a stark contrast when you have a video and when you don't.
Yeah, Liz, I might just touch on your point there. I'm trying to figure out how to design a UX research program. I'm assuming that's internal for your company?
University, yeah.
Oh, cool. Wow, that is really awesome. And it is so good to see universities starting to teach UX. At the moment in Australia, at least, it's mostly done through sort of short courses right now. You don't really have a UX degree. I designed a UX research program for product managers, actually, so it's a bit of a different audience. But if you like, I can share with you everything I did, because I'm happy to talk about it. It's very lengthy though, so I won't go into too much detail here. But yeah, happy to chat.
That would be awesome.
Can do. All right. Another question for Renee. Have the stakeholders or developers, oh, sorry, that wasn't a question, that was a comment. Have the stakeholders or developers be an observer? Yes, really, really good point, Renee, too. I'm a big fan of research being a team sport. So I know, like, some other researchers I speak to are like, oh no, you mustn't get people involved because they'll dirty the research. But if you're getting people observing, put them to work, get them to take notes as well, and actually teach them how to take really good notes so they understand the difference between just writing, oh, this person did this, and what's actually going to be useful for you as someone who will be synthesizing the data. I like to get my stakeholders to help me tag the notes as well, or try an affinity map them. They don't always get it right, but that way they're getting in amongst the data and they feel more of a sense of ownership over it, which means they're more likely to take it on board when you present it back to them as insights because they had a hand in shaping them, or at least they think they did.
I just wanted to add to that too. Absolutely try and get people to observe, but I always do like to warn them if you watch one, you can't walk away and make a decision based on that. Because I've definitely had stakeholders be like, oh, but participant A struggled. I'm like, yeah, but you didn't watch the other 4. So it's just a good caveat to add.
Yeah, and that's another reason why you, after every research study you run, do a debrief session with those stakeholders, get them together and actually say, right, what did you notice in the session you observed? And they're sharing with each other what they saw and heard. So they come away with a more full view of what happened, not just what they thought. And you can also do a bit of affinity mapping or synthesis in that session too, which really helps.
Have you guys found that in your work, people confuse the role of UX researcher and UX designer? Have you been in a position where people have tried to get you to do design?
Yes.
I'll let Caylie answer that one because I do both.
Yeah. So
awesome.
Yeah. So depending, I'll start off by saying in Australia, the UX and UX research industry is nowhere near as developed as it is in the US. It's a lot smaller. I know most of the UX researchers in Melbourne, so we have a harder time just explaining to people why we exist. In my previous role, yes, I did once have a head of product ask me to do some visual design, and I was like, you sure you want that? That's not going to go down very well. I think now, even over the past sort of 3-4 years, UX research as its own discipline is becoming more and more known in Melbourne, so it happens a lot less. In the instances where it does happen, again, I could be cheeky and sort of say, do you want me to show you some PowerPoints I've made and how terrible they are in terms of not being visual? Yeah, and I think to Kayla's point, in Australia, you still get people who kind of do a bit of both just because of the way the market is. Like I used to wireframe as well. Caylie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess also from the other perspective, I have worked with designers who, you know, have learned the idea of UX research and think they can do it. And it's not that they won't ever be able to do it. It's just that they're asking really biasing questions and then go away and say, oh, look, my design's valid. So while I think, and I am a designer and a researcher, I think people like that absolutely exist, but maybe there's some more mentoring needed or just some, you know, on the job assistance. And also I bias participants occasionally, you know, no one's perfect, and you just make a note and you either throw that inside out or you know, course correct for the next interview. It's just building that up over time.
Yeah, I should mention too, a big part of my role and a lot of UX researcher roles in Melbourne at least is coaching designers on how to do their more tactical research in a better way.
So in my organization, we're at a maturity level where we're starting to get people recognizing that user research should happen. But we don't necessarily have enough user researchers to do all the research. So what we're getting is a lot of project managers or product analysts going and talking to users, not necessarily recording anything or writing anything down or standardizing the process and saying, okay, now we've done user research. When you guys have encountered people who have been interested in getting involved, do you have any kind of minimum viable product that you can kind of share that you can expect when we say something is user research versus you just had a nice chat with potential client?
Because I think we've both experienced this quite a lot. So this actually relates to the product manager training I mentioned earlier. In my view, before you go out and call whatever it is you're doing user research, you need to have completed some kind of training with our research team. That would be basic facilitation skills, so knowing how to not ask leading questions, also structuring an interview guide or a moderation guide. We make sure those are reviewed by one of us before people go out and do stuff. The other one is around, I guess, the type and number of conversations you're having. So if a product manager says to me, oh, you know, I went out with sales yesterday and had a chat to this client and they told me this, I'd be like, great, that's a conversation. Good for you. If, on the other hand, they have a problem space and they come to me and say, oh, you know, I need to understand this, I need to speak to these types of users, I will then go and review their method, their interview guide, and make sure they've done a bit of training, and one of the product managers in my team has actually done that, then that's research. So that's the difference. Number of participants, the rigor, whether it's been reviewed by one of us and whether they've had a bit of training, that would be the line I draw. What about you, Kayla?
Yeah, very similar. I did get a PM while I was still working at Seek to run some testing and I was the note taker. There was a bit of, I don't know, dissent in the team about whether that was okay. This particular PM had a PhD in qualitative research. So I was like, he's going to be fine. He knows what he's doing. So we ran a pilot study. And again, I just noted a couple of times where his questions were a bit leading. And then we course corrected. And I think that study was actually quite well run. I can see a related question in the chat around where stakeholders have already spoken to users and hand over their notes and just expect you to use it. Much as what Caylie said, if it just sounds like a conversation, if there's not a lot of rigor, I would then take that and say, thank you for these possible insights, which I will now explore in some research. So I would try and build on them and, you know, in a diplomatic way, not throw them away, because they potentially are really good. You can sometimes see one Hotjar comment or something that kicks off a research study and you find gold.
Cool. I hope if we haven't quite hit the mark on some of your questions, please let us know. I'm also aware I am speaking a lot faster now. I'm speaking off the cuff, so hopefully you can understand me.
Anyone else want to ask a question who hasn't gotten to?
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if we're learning UX, are there any good resources for just trying to, I guess, learn how to do UX research and try to do it properly, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could go back to textbooks. There's one in particular that I mean, it's probably really old now. His Newman research method. So any kind of qualitative research method books I found really useful, and I've been referring back to them throughout my my PhD thesis, even though I, you know, learnt that stuff ages ago. It's always just good to refresh yourself. And there's a particular section on interview tips, which I like to actually just reread and refer to when I'm about to run a study and haven't run one in a while. And there's some suggestions in the chat as well. Steve Portugal's book, Interviewing Users.
Yeah, that's a good basic one for sort of just getting stuck into user interviews, which is a pretty common method. Another thing I would recommend, get on Medium and just subscribe to a bunch of different UX publications. There is some really good stuff out there and it's mostly free. I lived off Medium in my first couple of years as a junior. Another book I've got, which I haven't started reading yet, but I hear is very good, is Think Like a UX Researcher. That's literally the title. And like Kayla said, sometimes if you're feeling really keen, you can go back to your academia books and just, I think there's one called Qualitative Research Methods in Anthropology, which is an old book, but good for a sort of overview of different methods. And again, if you've got people around you, like in your organization or people you know in industry, ask them to just mentor you, buy them a coffee and say, hey, can I pick your brain about how you started out? What did you do to learn what you know? That was really beneficial for me too when I was starting out. I had kind of 3 people in my organization who I would go to for different skill sets. And it's, you know, partially because of them. I guess I would credit a lot of my success now to them because they were so wonderful. It makes a huge difference.
Kaylee, I just wanted to add a caveat on the Medium thing. I love Medium. I write on Medium a lot, but sometimes I read posts that are just maybe not so accurate. So, and some of them are published through, you know, UX Collective as well, and it's telling people the totally wrong advice. So I would take some of that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, David Ross has mentioned UX Team of One. Another one is Just Enough Research by Erica Hall. That's a good resource as well.
All right, anybody else want to unmute and ask a question? Hmm?
We're bamboozled you all. That's okay. I will find that article by Lisa Reichart, if you just bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can post it in the chat.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, if anybody wasn't monitoring the chat, that I did post Kayla and Caylie's article that inspired this talk in the chat. So please read if you haven't gotten a chance to.
And that has a lot of the links to the references that we used. So yeah, you can put them in your emails to your stakeholders.
Yes. So, and I've just posted that article by Lisa Reichart. So I think it's part 2 or 3. She talks about more numbers doesn't necessarily mean better. That's a fantastic resource. I use that one quite a lot.
Oh, thank you for that. I'm going to use that too. Okay, anyone else? Even repeat question askers?
So you guys went through probably 6 to 8 different questions and methods. What have you found to be most effective to turn skeptics into advocates for the UX research process?
Ooh, that's a good question.
It depends on what matters to the stakeholder. So stakeholders that, you know, care about quant and not qual, then I will pull out that Norman reference and be like, hey, look, quant study that validates this qual thing that we're doing. If they're metrics driven, I will show that, hey, look, remember when we did that UX project and then that KPI moved by 5% or whatever the case may be. I like to collect the success stories so that I can pull them out and go, remember this, remember that. But it does vary on what matters to the person. So I had another stakeholder who had someone in their family with a particular illness, which I won't disclose what it is, but when we helped the life of a participant who had that same illness, then they were like, oh, I see the value. So sometimes it's really the heart, sometimes it's the head. It's just whatever your stakeholder values that you'll be able to appeal to.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I will often tweak my presentations depending on who I'm presenting it to. So strategy, for example, love silly graphs and big fancy words. So I'll use big fancy words, and that's where the terminology argument comes in handy as well. So ensuring I'm talking about my research in the right way, using I guess more academic language, really appeals to the strategy folks because they're all very important people and they like to think they're very smart. Whereas maybe the UX team or the product folks might be a little bit more visual and I might actually explain what I do in a more casual way because they won't think I'm a snob that way, if that makes sense. Oh, there was something else I was going to mention too. I've forgotten what it was. Yeah, like Kayla said, just documenting your success stories, or even if you hear a stakeholder refer to something that you know was coming out of your research saying, oh yes, that was a finding in my study that I did on this, wasn't it? And they're like, oh yeah. Because sometimes they'll quote their research back at you, or sorry, they'll quote your own research back at you and you'll be like, yes, I know, I did the study. So just reminding them where they've learned that really works as well. Just got a comment from Blake. It seems like winning over skeptics is partly about convincing them that you want them to do well, and that's why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah, for sure. Like we all want the business to succeed, and we're all working together for the business. That's a big one too. And yeah, the triangulation of data. I feel like I'm going around in circles a bit, but when presenting to strategy, for example, I'll typically include their knowledge as well as mine. They're like, oh yes, well, you know, you've used our stuff. So it's sort of like you're making a reciprocal arrangement to use each other's data, if that makes sense. And you sort of sell it as well, you know, I'll support you by sharing your work. You can support me by sharing mine. So trying to join forces with the people in your organization.
Okay, any final comments or questions? Or random life complaints?
I just want to say thank you. This was a great chat and very, very useful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're glad you found it useful. It's always nice. I think, yeah, Kayla's a lot more experienced than me at talking at these types of things. So yeah, appreciate the
I love that I can do it from my home now though. Because it opens us up to, you know, being able to talk to you guys in the States as well. And it's great.
Yeah.
That part has been pretty amazing to be able to invite people to talk to us who are just outside of our city. It's been fantastic.
Yeah.
And if you're ever in Melbourne, you know, reach out, say hi, maybe in a couple of years from now when we can travel again.
I don't know. I just heard there are really scary spiders there.
I mean,
Yeah, when I was talking, a spider started coming down, which does not normally happen, but I thought was so funny. Like just a little one, I killed it. It's fine. Little, it was not a poisonous.
It's like this big, right?
Yeah.
Melbourne, like you don't get really massive spiders here. Like the biggest one I've seen is probably, you know, that. I grew up in regional Victoria in the country, so spiders don't worry me. They're much bigger out there. We are Australian after all.
We'll cut that part out of the YouTube video. Yeah, folks, this will be posted to YouTube, so you can share with other UX researchers or those who need convincing, which, you know, hopefully is not that many people left in the world, but still. Yeah, so we'll have this posted soon, and we really appreciate you guys joining us. Yeah, lots of people have said so in the chat, but I wanted to reiterate that.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to stop the recording officially, so any further comments won't be captured, alas, but